Hello again, Pastor Ben Miller, and today we're looking at the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto, and this is our last video we're doing in this series. So without further ado, we're going to get right into it. We're going to start with asking this question. Who is responsible for teaching your kids? Whose job is it to make sure they're educated and to make sure what they get educated with? What subject they're taught and how they are taught those subjects? Whose responsibility is to make sure they're getting a good education and in even some respects to teach them? And basically I think you have two choices. You either have, is it the state's job or it's your job? Now I want to point out here what we're not talking about is homeschooling or Christian schooling as opposed to public school. Okay? But what we're really talking about, should everybody be required by law to go to the government school? Okay? And should the federal government have autonomy? In other words, should your local school board make decisions which are accountable, who are accountable to you, or should just whoever happens to be president or be in control of Congress, they make all the decisions? And they say, well, what does this have to do with Marxism and socialism and communism? Well, let's read the 10th plank here. They say, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factories, labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. Alright, so some things here don't sound too bad, right? So if you have to remember when Marx is writing, child labor in factories was a big thing. It was a problem. They were exploited, certainly, in certain places for sure, during Marx's time. So it sounded like, hey, he's dealing with this, he's going to get rid of it, but when you read closely, not necessarily, because right, he says in its present form. So he's not just going to get rid of child labor, just in its present form, and a combination of education with industrial production. All right, and I want us to ask ourselves this question: what kind of education he's talking about? And really, it's just government propaganda put out by the centralized government. And you say, well, how do you know this? How can you say this, Pastor, then that's what Marx is referring to? Well, first off, Marx elsewhere in the Communist Manifesto actually answers claims that he is going to get rid of private education too, which he pretty much says, yes, we're going to do that. But what I want to point out to you why socialistly run public school system is terrible is because it completely undermines truths and values that we believe, that parents believe, ought to be instilled in their children. And you say, well, that's not really true, Pastor Ben. Well, in the page right before it, so I've been reading these 10 planks. Now here on page 26, I'm going to read 2 paragraphs to you about things that Marx says the communists believe. He says, undoubtedly, it'll be said, religion and moral philosophical and juridical ideas may have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive the change. So he's saying, society tends to change over time, but these 5 things somehow seem to escape the change over time. As now he says, there are besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc. So he says freedom and justice are eternal truths. Continue. That are common to all states of society. All right. So these are again. So freedom and justice and these other things I mentioned, they are common to all societies. All societies hold these as timeless truths. Now notice what Marx says about these. He says, but communism abolishes eternal truth. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences. So what do you think they're going to be teaching in these schools? They're going to be teaching there's no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as freedom. There is no truth. That's what they're going to be teaching in these schools because that's what Marx says. He says that's our goal. Communism, holds to no eternal truths. Communism obliterates all religion. Think about that. That kind of makes sense then, doesn't it? Why Darwinism and evolution is pushed so hard in the public schools. Because they hold to Marxism and they want to obliterate justice and freedom, which means that if you say that you're for justice and you're also a Marxist, you have a problem. Because Marxism obliterates justice. So organizations like Black Lives Matter that say they're for social justice but they're also Marxists, they either are contradicting themselves or what they mean by justice is not what real justice is. It is a perverted justice to fit their personal agenda. And they're really just using certain groups to push a Marxist agenda that has nothing to do with those groups. And we got to think about, is that what's really going on and the dangers that are here? Now, so Marx believes that it should be the state that educates your children. And that the state should basically brainwash your kids into not believing what you believe. Now, I think to some degree we see some of this in our own education system in the United States. Now, I wouldn't say we have totally gone over to that even yet, okay? But I do think that things like No Child Left Behind, which was put in place by a Republican, George Bush, are steps in the wrong direction because it gives the government more control, more influence, more ability to regulate the schools, which then is what? Taking power away from local school boards and local parents to make decisions about what things are taught to their kids. I mean, shouldn't the local school boards be able to decide whether or not we teach evolution or creation or both of them together or some sort of Native American creation myth? Shouldn't that be up to the parents of the children? And I would argue Scripture does place that in the realm of parents. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think parents are not following Scripture when they necessarily send their kids to public school, because it's their decision. Scripture puts it on the onus of the parents, and so they may send their kids to school to learn to read and write, but they should definitely realize that their kids aren't being taught the Scriptures, and that it's really their job anyways to teach their kids the truth, these eternal truths about freedom and justice, and to instill them into the hearts of their kids. And they can do that, potentially even sending them to public school. But they have to take some things very seriously, and particularly church. Needs to be something they regularly attend, I would argue, too. But we see here in Exodus 20 in the Ten Commandments, right? One of the Ten Commandments, right? Honor your father and your mother that your days may be long in the land. Now, why? So, well, what does that have to do with education? I'm just showing that God gives the responsibility to take care of and provide for children to the parents. It's not the state's job to provide for kids. It's the parents' job. Because notice the commandment doesn't say, children honor the state. It says honor who? Your parents. In other words, the parents are an ultimate authority over the children because God has put them in that position. And then we also see an example, which there's lots of, Scripture speaks to the responsibility of training one's child up in the way that he should go in the truth of the gospel in multiple places, not just the Old Testament, but well as the New Testament. We're just going to look at Deuteronomy here, 6:20. It says, when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded you, things that speak to justice and freedom, like in the Ten Commandments. So here's the son, he reads the Ten Commandments, or he goes to church on Sunday with dad, and he asks questions where the parents are supposed to respond. Verse 21, then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good, always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. And it will be righteous for us if we are careful to do this commandment before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. So the parent explains to the child the truth about God, the eternal truth about God. And here he's explaining to them how God has saved the nation in the past. For us here in the New Testament, those who are saved, we go to church and maybe our child asks us, why do we go to church? Why do we do these things? And we think, well, I was lost in my sin. I was condemned. I was headed to hell. And then these were the sins I was committing, and then I realized I was a sinner and I needed God, and this is the event in my life where God spoke to my heart, where I surrendered my life to Him, and He began to change me. I became a different person, and so now I follow God, and I love His Word, and you should too, because you're in the same boat, and we are now passing on those eternal truths in normal conversation around the dinner table, in working in the yard, in the car ride to and from church, in Sunday school, in prayer meeting. Now, these responsibilities fall with us parents to instill these things in our kids, whether we send our kid to a public school, whether we homeschool, or whether we send them to a Christian private school. These things, these responsibilities lay with us. Let us not simply abdicate them to somebody else, because they may not have, as we see with Marxism, the same values and the same principles, even when it comes to the idea of public school. And I do think, while this amendment doesn't speak directly to the idea of schooling, and I don't know if the founders really would have envisioned what we have today as a public school system, but if you think about the First Amendment for a minute, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, which would happen under Marx's plan, right? Because Marx's plan is to what? Obliterate a religion. So in his plan, right, the government is going to limit and scale back and force religion to bow to its whims. But our amendment says no. That we as parents are free to teach our children our religion. And we're free to do so in whichever way God has said we ought to, or we feel that God is telling us to. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof of the religion, or abridging the freedom of speech. See, here's the thing. As long as you have the freedom of speech, you really can't have mandated government public schooling. Yeah, you might be able to mandate that children go to school, but whether or not that is in a government school or a private school or a home school, the reality of it is the government really, as long as, in order to have free speech, you have to have free choice of schools, which is really why I think it'd be a good idea for free choice of schools. You know, well, you have to go to the school because you're in this district. No, you can go to this public school. Create competition. That is the best thing for education, because it also forces teachers to be better, right? Because if it's up to competition, if our school isn't good, we lose the kids, we lose our funding. Not good. So those are things that I think ought to be allowed. And they go against communism and socialist thinking, and particularly Marxism. So to close with, right, who's responsible for teaching your children eternal truths, such as freedom and justice and the gospel? It's you. You are the one ultimately responsible to stand before God. And see, that's important to think about all this as we think about freedom. See, men should be free in regards to religion, in regards to free speech, because we as individuals have to give an account to God for what we believe on Judgment Day. Governments don't. And we'll have to give an account before God on how and what we instructed our children in. Government's not so much. So we're the ones who are responsible. We need to take that responsibility very seriously. And as we bring this now, as I'm bringing this all to an end, I mean, I think we've seen very clearly that Marx and Engels were completely off the mark when it comes to Scripture. That communism and socialism and Marxism, that is based in Marxism, is immoral at its very core. It is anti-God, it is immoral, it wants to obliterate a religion and eternal truths. I mean, what makes them eternal? Which I think should bring us all hope when we do see socialist ideas advancing, is that these eternal truths are eternal because they are truths that reflect God's character. And God is eternal, and His Word is eternal, and it cannot be obliterated, and it never will be. And so we should take our stand with the winning side, with those eternal truths. As Jesus tells us to do what? The wise man does what? Builds his life upon what? The words of Christ. And that's what we too need to do. I'm Pastor Ben Mellon. Till next time, live long and prosper.